you like to introduce yourself, what you used to do,
Sure.
and then what you're currently doing?
Yeah,
and what you're about to do, to be fair.
I'll start with an apology, really. You've all been missold. When Chris asked me to do this last year, we were playing cricket, I think.
We were.
And he said, hey, I'm doing this conference, blah, blah, blah. And I said, yeah, sure. He said, it's in Amsterdam in February. And I was quite happy to say yes on the basis of two absolute certainties. February would never come. And, you know, Amsterdam, it'd be dead easy, it'd be fine. So I went, yeah, no problem, sure, fine. Unfortunately, and back when he asked me, my job was that I was the home news editor at Sky News, so it was kind of my job to wander in the morning and figure out what on earth we're going to put on the telly. And figure out what stories we're going to tell and how we're going to tell them, and then sort of, you know, how we're going to respond to what goes on, and just kind of knit the whole fucking thing together. That was the plan. That's what we were going to talk about. But then, just to kind of ruin this great idea, I, perhaps slightly foolishly, stopped doing the news and went to go and work in entertainment, and comedy in particular. I suppose, you know, after the election of Donald Trump and Britain going for Brexit, it seemed a short jump at that point from news to comedy. And so now I, well, just next week, in fact, we start doing the next series of, I don't know how many people here are familiar with a British comedy show called Have I Got News For You, which I'm going to start sort of APing next week. So,
sorry, APing?
Assistant producing. I think mostly photocopying and tea making and things. So that's kind of that's the slightly odd journey for why why it says former on this little lanyard. But I hope at least that you guys will forgive that and not ignore everything I have to say. Or actually, maybe you should.
We'll reserve judgment for now.
Yeah.
So you've touched on some of it already, but fake news. How do we... What's your view on fake news? A lot of stuff gets branded as fake. A lot of stuff is fake but doesn't get picked up. How on earth, as news editor at Sky, do you tell the difference?
Well, I suppose you're right in that lots of stuff gets branded as fake news, and of course it's something that has kind of got legs again with all the energy around Donald Trump and that sort of stuff. But actually, just on my way here, let me just get these in front of me. I was just looking at some real, legit British newspaper headlines from a cracking publication, which some of you may be aware of, called The Sunday Sport. And I'll go in no particular order. And these were, I'm not making these up, these are actually printed in a newspaper that people would go and buy on a Sunday. Boris sex dwarf drowns in giant trifle. Gordon Ramsay sex dwarf eaten by badger. Jeremy Corbyn sex dwarf eaten by otters. So obviously it's thematic, but I suppose the point about this is that, you know, fake news, that sort of counts and is there every Sunday, and I think we can probably agree that a Jeremy Corbyn sex dwarf probably hasn't been eaten by a badger, and so that's your starting point, I guess. We can all be pretty sure that's not right. I think the interesting thing over the last couple of years has been obviously the conflation between people suggesting something is fake and people suggesting something is just not what they fancy, yes. Which I suppose is the key thing. In terms of the nuts and bolts of, you asked the question of how do you tell the difference. It is, in many ways, dead easy. A bit like, you know, all of the great scoops that everybody can think of for, you know, kind of, I don't know, Watergate, any other scoop someone would like to sort of think of. They've basically happened because people have done the basics really well. They've basically just happened because people have just gone, well, hang on, that doesn't seem right. Well, hang on, if that, you know, and people have just kind of done, you know, 100 tiny things in order. So I suppose the sort of answer is just go, well, let's kind of do what we're paid to do and do some journalism about it and say, well, you know, what's the source of it, that kind of thing. So in that sense, it's dead easy. But of course, in reality, as stories move and develop and that sort of stuff, I suppose it's sort of required that it gets harder. and it requires a sort of constant willingness to sort of refer back to the sort of smell test of a story. Well, hang on, does this seem, right? I have to confess, in my experience, I don't recall anybody ever sort of, trying to sell some huge untruth, unless you include 350 million quid a week for the NHS. But I don't recall people sort of ringing up saying, "Hey, black is white," or that sort of thing. But I think, particularly if you work in politics and in political reporting, I think that can perhaps be more of a challenge as people look to shape that narrative a bit.
Okay. And so you choose what goes on the telly. How do you start curating that? And do you have your audience in mind when you choose what news to show them? So we'll talk later about people self-curating, echo chambers, Facebook doing that. From a mass broadcaster point of view, you've got an audience. Are they front of mind when you are deciding what to show them?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously at Sky we call them customers. There are 3 people that can sack you in your job if you do that job. Put broadly, your boss, talent, or the audience. Mm-hmm. And if you screw it up with any of them, you're stuffed. And the audience are probably the most important. I can say that now because my boss isn't my boss anymore. To a degree, I suppose the answer to your question is, obviously if you're making 24-hour news, you're not making bulletin news, so you have to think about who's watching at different times, who's consuming the news at different times.
So when you say bulletin news, help us out here.
Bulletin news, BBC 1 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 10 o'clock news, NBC's nightly news, 7:30 Eastern Time, the ITV news at 10, Sky, in fact, in my time at Sky, sort of flirted around with a couple of blue chip bulletin times. We had 7 o'clock for a long time, and more recently 10 o'clock. So, sort of appointment to view television, the sort of perhaps slightly old-fashioned, although I would argue not too old-fashioned idea that people sit down and go, right, tell me what's happened today. Mm-hmm. But obviously if you're making 24-hour news, you've got to think about who the audience is at different times. And I suppose it sort of splits into 2. This sounds sort of wrong-headed, but bear with me. The easiest days in the world are days when tons of things are happening, massive stories, because, it's kind of straightforward. You just look to make sure you're telling the story in a compelling and interesting and candid way. You look to make sure that you're bringing your customers as much as you can, as up-to-date as you can, and accurately, and all that stuff. Where you really earn your money are quiet Thursdays in August when there's nothing going on and you're just you're not quite doing Boris Sex Dwarfs, but you're kind of, you're sort of having to knit it together. So in those instances, you think about the sort of shape of a day and who's watching. Some of it's very traditional and predictable. Breakfast television is, I think, it goes pretty much across national boundaries. The shape of breakfast television is always the same. It's slightly soft to the gender skew, is slightly more pronounced. News bulletins in the evening tend to be harder. So you really it's about sort of, I guess, you think about making sure you get the stuff that you think your customers will want in front of them at the right time. Mm-hmm. And just actually on that, I do think that if everybody looks on, I don't know, the BBC website or something now, the last story would have been updated 2 minutes ago, 30 seconds ago, whatever it might be. I think there's some really interesting examples of people pushing against that and trying to do sort of appointment to view broadcasting or appointment to view telling of the news in a different way. I think that the Times in London is really interesting. They do an update 3 times a day on their website. I think it's 6 a.m., midday, and 5 p.m., so I don't know exactly what times. But if stuff happens in the interim, they say, look, people have an appointment to view with us, and they come 3 times a day, and it works for them. And I think it's clearly a successful model for them as far as it goes. So I think that's an interesting counter to the idea that audiences need, the news right now, every time. I think there is a market for slightly more considered, slightly more thought through news.
Interesting. And that's a pay for?
Yeah, it's behind a paywall. I mean, and that's the sort of, I suppose that's the kind of religious view one needs to take about this stuff, which is that whether people are willing to pay for good quality journalism, and that's clearly a matter for the consumer, but I am.
The economic consequence, of course, is that you're not chasing clicks in the way that some of the others are with the breaking news, the immediacy, the almost fake urgency.
Yeah, I mean, to a degree, I think that the sort of the suggestion that people chase clicks and the like, clearly that there is a sector that does that, but at the same time, being popular is not a sin, and being read is not a sin, and being in demand is not a sin. And I think that sometimes, television executives can sit in glass-walled rooms and say, "Why are we doing this rubbish these listicles? Let's do sort of, a 7,000-word New Yorker meditation on the nature of a Xerox machine." Whereas actually, you need people there. You need your readers, consumers there. You need their eyeballs before you can get anything else.
And is the consumer attention span changing, leading to a dumbing down of the news?
I don't know. I can't think of anything sort of empirical to sort of suggest that. I certainly think that if you can't keep your consumers, you don't deserve to have them. Mm-hmm. And so I think it would be churlish for anybody running certainly a news organisation, perhaps any kind of organisation, to go, right, you people, you owe me your engagement time, whatever. But look, yeah, it's certainly a challenge, and I think if you look at, I don't know how many people are familiar with American news and American network news. They have a sort of different grammar to their television that does reflect that. You're talking about very, very tight packages, sound bites just clipped to within an inch of, and that's, I don't think that's no sort of broad brush thing about Americans being daft or anything. It's just, I think, a reflection of the fact that in the major markets, in US broadcasting at least, they perhaps feel that way, I think.
And that level of curation becomes really interesting when it comes to shaping the view of an audience, not just informing them of what's going on.
Yeah.
And we joked briefly downstairs about a certain politician who I won't name unless you want to.
Oh God, I can't remember. Oh. I'm very happy to sit here and be horrid about Gordon. God.
No, but the fact that he answers the question.
Right. Yeah. We were talking about. Chris asked me to do a clip downstairs, and I was just sort of before I worked at Sky. I worked in politics at ITN for a long time, and it was during the years when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, and Gordon was an unspeakable nightmare to try and do television with, from the producer's point of view, because Gordon had the same answer, whatever it was going to be. Hey Gordon, what do you think of the weather? Well, I think it's important that we keep focusing on the economy, and I think it's important that we really recognise that it's been an end to boom and bust, yada yada. Hey Gordon, who's your favourite kid? It was the same thing again and again and again and again. And as we were saying, you end up using the bloody Gordon clip with him talking about the economy because it's all you have. Yeah.
And so
I'm not picking on Gordon. Lots of people do that, but I am slightly picking on Gordon.
Okay, so where are the credible news sources going to be in the future? Have we hit the end of Facebook trying to pretend to be credible news?
Well, I suppose, as I'm sure so many people in this room experience in different ways across different industries, Facebook doesn't actually produce very much at all. I think there is certainly an ongoing conversation in newsrooms, certainly in Britain, about quite why we're giving our really cool content to Facebook, mostly for free or for a very slightly odd model, but mostly for free, and they are then, as you say, curating it and looking to make a profit on it. I think that, in a funny way, and I can only sort of speak for myself in this, I'm not a big Facebook person, and I suspect that when people would say to me, they would sort of reel out these metrics at me that were just staggering. Something about, I seem to remember talking at a thing last year and asserting, because it had been given to me on a bit of paper, that Sky News had done a billion social media, I don't know if views is the right word, or engagements in some form in that year. So you look at that and you think, fuck, right, well, this is a place that you need to be because, again, in the spirit of going to your viewers. But I think that when you actually break down what those engagements really are, and when you break down what you're getting in exchange for those billion, I'm not saying one shouldn't do it. I think particularly if one is not a commercial organisation, if you say the BBC, I think I can see the argument for that. But if you're having to sort of refer it back to the business and sort of asking yourself about the Sky News as its place within the wider Sky, I think that's more difficult.
And do you think that will see a bit of a change of focus from the news companies to try and be more their own entity? I mean, I think we've chatted about artists needing to be their own entity, being the destination for them, for the fan every time. Do you think we'll see a similar echoing on the news side?
I think everyone would like that, because obviously you want people on your own, looking at things on your own platform, wherever it might be it the telly or anything else. I think in reality that's hard, but I did think that obviously, this is not going to be a surprise to anybody, I'm not particularly speaking out of turn, the looming Premier League rights at Sky were a big thing sitting in every room one sat in.
So just for broad context, Sky built its business roughly by having exclusive rights to football. That was roughly how they got everyone to spend a small fortune every month, ish. And it was a really key stepping stone for them. There was an unbundling of the rights, so BT Sport came in 2 years back and competed.
Last
longer?
Auction, so three maybe.
3 years back.
Like that, yeah.
And so football got unbundled, so you now don't get all the games from one single supplier, which for the consumer, of course, is not fantastic because you end up paying twice. But these are critical to how Sky got to where Sky got to. Sorry, just for context.
No, you're right. You're right to say that. And so the last auction, Sky paid £5 and a bit billion for the Premier League package, and obviously that's a fair bit of cash. But at the same time, as Chris says, in the context of Sky's business being built on sport, it is, depending on how you look at it, either a shitload of money or kind of it doesn't matter because you have to have them. So if it was 500 billion, you have to have them. So, But obviously, since that happened, as you get to the next round of Premier League rights, every meeting you go to at Sky would have, there would be one of the things that would be in your mind, so that was in my mind, was, right, Premier League rights are going to be up again. They've gone up. The prices keep going up exponentially. We need to figure out how we're going to, sustain that. Mm-hmm. And then we had the auction. What was it, last week or this week? I can't remember. And the overall cost of package A, the package that's the main package, went down. And the really interesting thing about it, I thought, was that there had for a long time been this spectre of someone like Amazon or Google or somebody of the sort coming and sort of sweeping in and disrupting the sports rights market, which I don't think would necessarily be a bad thing for the consumer. But clearly, if you run a business like Sky, it's a concern. And I suspect Amazon will still get involved for some of the overseas rights. But it was interesting that didn't happen. And that's not to say that the corollary of that is not that everybody gets rid of Facebook tomorrow. Of course, that's not. But I think that sometimes, if like me, you're a bit of a doofus when it comes to Facebook and don't really get it and talk about downloading more RAM or something, and then someone brings you staggering metrics, you sort of go, right, well, I look at that, I don't really understand this, okay, fine, let's do this. And it doesn't necessarily follow that it's going to be, that growth is not just going to go and go and go and go. And I think the football rights is an interesting thing to sort of see in parallel to that.
That's really interesting. Is there a question in the audience at this stage? Sylv, I thought you might have one for me. There's a mic coming. Won't be a second.
Hi, I'm Sylvia.
Hey, Sylvia.
I wanted to get your take on whether what we call the kind of official news channels are genuinely worried enough about the number of so-called news sources, websites and channels that are setting themselves up that are actually spreading fake news and very successfully spreading it through Twitter and Facebook and other mediums like that. And also your take on what the consumer can do to make sure that they're actually doing their own investigative journalism and fact-checking before they just blindly believe what they get served and then share it with everybody else.
Yeah, no, sure. Those are both good questions. Obviously, I can't speak for everybody in the sort of, the kind of heritage news world that you sort of talk about. But I don't think that, I don't think you worry about it in and of itself, because at the end of the day, you sort of hope that if you're doing a good product and it is significantly better than, other whatever else is around, you hope that people will come to it. I think to a degree, I remember an example during the American elections. It can have a sort of chilling effect when it comes to reporting the news on the ground. Certainly, I remember for lots of Sky correspondents who were reporting around very red states in the U.S. election, the narrative of fake news was something that, if you'd interview someone in the street, they'd go, well, we won't talk to you because you're fake news, because you're simply saying, well, there's a chance Hillary might win, or something. I think that had an impact, and it certainly had an impact in, as perhaps one felt this a bit closer to home, because in the last British general election, there was quite a lot of energy expended by Labour Party supporters. I can remember a couple of occasions at press conferences and the like, where people would do the sort of conflating of Sky News and Murdoch, and we'd sort of get down that slight sort of rabbit hole. So I think in terms of actually, sitting on the news desk, kind of conducting the orchestra, it's not a huge concern, because you just think we'll just keep doing what we're doing. I think for people that actually have to go out and do it, perhaps it does impact their lives more, because they sort of, there is a kind of perhaps a lack of trust sometimes from people they meet, in the streets, or people they try and report from. But at the same time, that's kind of okay, because there's nothing so bad about an instinctive lack of trust. It kind of, in a way, it sort of leads to your second question, I suppose the answer to, how to not get down the rabbit hole of fake news, I suppose, is to sort of, a bit like in the spirit of all those scoops, that sort of stuff. Doing the basics pretty well is probably a good way to go. Things like just saying, well, in general, does this seem likely? And not quite the otter sex dwarfs, but that was just a phrase I wondered if I could say today, by the way.
You've done well so far.
Yeah.
Is there some bingo card you've hidden?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I think also, and of course I would sort of say this, I think good journalism costs money, and I fear the answer might be if one has to pay for it.
Good answer. Kath.
Hi, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on video and audio manipulation software. And there's been just very recently a very interesting podcast on Radiolab around software that really ultimately allows you to go back and pull videos together and have someone say something that they truly didn't say but looks completely and totally real.
Right.
And similarly, being able to change audio clips, etc. I find that particularly scary, and I think that that's going to be presented as real news and look real, and it's going to be very hard to check. I'm just curious how news outlets are addressing that potential threat.
Yeah, God, I have to say, I'm not familiar with that technology, but I entirely agree. That presents all sorts of, I'm sure we can all think of a number of kind of, sort of hot mic kind of things where, or undercover stuff, that sort of stuff, where people say stuff that they would of course then deny that they said. I suppose to a degree, although only to a degree, that's again where the kind of the nuts and bolts around doing good quality journalism counts. If it's sort of looking at sourcing around the story, it's also sort of the slightly less glamorous things which some people certainly in the online space don't do when they publish some of their stuff, which is the kind of right to reply things. And if you're accusing me of X, Y, Z, and I was sort of, and I'm the news editor, and someone says, right, well, we've got this story, then we'd go to them and say, listen, we've got this story, what do you have to say? And if they say, well, not only did I not say it because I wasn't there with that guy, but in fact, here I am playing golf at Sandy Lane at the same time, and so it sort of doesn't add up. So I suppose to a degree, it's sort of also about doing the good quality journalism around it. But you're right, there's no that wouldn't always get you out of jail, because there's always the chance that people are just lying, which is I fear I don't have the answer for being able to sort of post de facto create reality. That sounds like a bloody nightmare. Thank God I got into comedy.
I think, is there a question? Is it Chris?
Yeah. Hiya, how you doing? As a lot of people in this room, our relationship on a professional level with news is probably trying to create dialogues in the artists we work with that qualifies news, but is probably marketing. Mm-hmm. As someone who picks what becomes news, what's your relationship with people who are creating those sort of stories? When do you decide, yeah, this is something I want to tell the world about? Or when do you put your foot down and say, come on, I'm not your advert?
That's a really good question. And there's probably an official answer and a not official answer, and I'll sort of try and do both. The official answer is the bar is high 100% of the time, and and the fact is that unless it's something that is journalistically sound and that we want to do, then 100% of the time that's what we'll do, and you have to get over that bar to do it. There is a kind of, in the unofficial answer, I think there is a practicality element about it, where all of those things remain true. I can't think of a single occasion where somebody's gone, this is a bullshit story, but I really like this artist, so let's do it. That wouldn't fly. But I often think that if you look at some of the people or organisations that manage those relationships well, I think it's about understanding the needs of news outlets. So, it's often quite prosaic stuff. There's usually some quite junior people in the office on a Sunday planning for Monday. Weekends in news organisations simply don't happen because nobody senior works, and they come in on Monday morning and go, we must do this story, and someone says, we did it over the weekend. And they go, well, we need to do it again now. So you have people in on a Sunday trying to pull together Monday's coverage with no real support, and if it's quiet or if it's difficult, somebody that pitches an idea, they're perhaps more likely to get a hearing just because you think, well, we can't just do Broadway show tunes on the news. We've got to do something. So I think there's little things like that, or things like understanding. And I can't speak for other countries, but for the UK, the laws around general or any elections, when you can't report on the nuts and bolts of politics on polling day. So there's 18 hours of airtime that's got to be filled with something, and it's not being filled with the thing that people have reported on endlessly for the last 6 weeks or whatever it might be. So I think sometimes it's sort of asking the question of, well, what do news outlets need? Early in the morning is often hard. BBC Breakfast in Salford at 6:20 struggle to get people on. And so if you can kind of work around that, to be absolutely clear, I'm not saying, I don't think anybody would, put something that was just daft and rubbish on just because it worked for them. But I think if you want to kind of increase your chances, often it's about having a look at what's going on in the world and saying, well, there's tons happening that day, so this just ain't going to get on because there's, this, that, the other. But, if you I don't know to what degree people sort of look to dovetail these with sort of forward planning diaries for, what's going on in the world. If you can go, well, actually, 2 weeks on Thursday looks quiet. Maybe we could sort of target that day. I fear the answer is kind of more prosaic than big thinking. I hope that's of some help.
Cool. Was James at the back? Sorry, Sarah. Back corner, please. Bless you.
Hi, Owen. One of the things that music's generally quite good at is that if we have a problem in the industry, organisations come together to tackle whether it's diversity or how we consume music or secondary ticketing or whatever it might be. Being loss-making in terms of news, obviously competition is rife between all the big networks. How could you guys maybe learn from music to work together to tackle big international challenges like terrorism and these sorts of things? Is there a way, and can that work?
You mean news organisations working together? I see what you mean. I think that's. I think that happens in small ways. Things, and again, quite boring and prosaic ways. Things like, there is only one news helicopter in Britain. There's not three for all the broadcasters because we just share the damn thing because it costs £500,000 a year. So, why spend that sort of stuff. So I think in small ways, we're often quite good at sharing. I fear the answer to sharing in bigger ways is that there is almost a sort of... you're in danger of then homogenizing other stuff. You're in danger of homogenizing your journalism, I suppose. And, in the spirit of journalism being about finding out stuff that is true and then telling people about it in a compelling way, I fear that if that sharing goes too far, there is you get left with, sort of... When I used to work in politics, we used to do these, you'd go somewhere with the Prime Minister, and the way it worked was, particularly for Gordon, who didn't like to travel, so there'd always be these nightmare trips, 18 hours around the world, no time to file or do anything. Essentially, what would happen was that everybody would get together at the back of the plane and go, right, what's the story? We'd all agree what the story was, and that would be the story that we'd all file to London. And then nobody gets stuffed, and everybody's kind of on top of things. Now, that's a kind of... that's kind of born out of necessity a little bit, and that's just, the occasional thing. I fear the danger of more cooperation might be a bit more back of the plane, which I think can sometimes have negative consequences as well.
Great, thank you. Steve?
Back on politics, I guess. Did the normalisation of political spin and the acceptance of it because of the demands of the news cycle lead to fake news?
I don't know about fake news. I think you're certainly, or the implication of your question is certainly right in that it's certainly kind of toxified to a degree, that relationship. But then I also think that kind of the sort of the Alistair Campbell et al. Sort of generation of spin doctors gets something of a bad name just because there was, this has gone on forever and ever and ever in different ways. I think in some ways you're right in that I sort of want to be fair to everybody here, rather than just reflect.
Don't worry about that.
Rather than just reflect my distaste for people. No, I think is the answer. No, because it doesn't matter what Alistair Campbell rings me up and says. He's doing his job. If I'm doing my job properly, what he says is simply part of a wider story that we tell. So I think it would be churlish of journalists to to sort of lay the blame of fake news at spin doctors or the like, because they are simply doing their job. I think really, if you're doing your job properly, it shouldn't have an impact. But of course, in reality, I know what you mean. It toxifies that environment, and it means I remember when we were doing, I can't remember what was going on. I think it was during one of Gordon's million crises that he, every week it was, something terrible was going on. And it was when, forgive me if this is very British for people, but people may know Peter Mandelson. Peter had been a sort of the architect of rebranding the Labour Party in the 90s, and had worked with Blair, aside from his manifold resignations over various things, and then had come back to work with Gordon. And Mandelson was nothing like the sort of caricature spin doctor that people think of. People think of the sort of Alistair Campbell, Damien McBride, sort of thick of it thing of, yelling expletives into the phone and stuff. Peter used to ring up and go, "Hi, darling, it's Peter. Hi." You go, "Hi, hi." He'd go, "I love that piece you did. I love it. It was great. It was great." "Oh, thanks, Peter. Thanks. I was just thinking whether maybe we could, And that, I think, in a way, was a more effective way than all the shouting. But still, whether it's the shouting and screaming, whether it's the, Peter sort of mollycoddling stuff, it's still, at the end of the day, the responsibility of journalism to, I think, to sort of prick that and to sort of say, well, hang on, that's not true, that's not true, that's not true. So as much as part of me would like to lay the blame at their feet, I don't think that would be fair.
Right. Do we have one last question? Stu, please. Sorry, Tom. Stu.
What if it's terrible now? I feel embarrassed. I'm kind of interested in this, the dynamic of news of two opposing sides. You have one guest for, one guest against. Yeah. Which is meant, on the one hand, you've got people like Nigel Farage in the UK, or the people who are a certain extreme have their say because they're constantly talking and they're the one side. And a lot of issues seem to boil down to, this person's against it, this person's for it, and they're kind of equal rights. Is that something you see being challenged now as there's kind of extremists on both political wings out and about and doing things? Is that going to be a problem for news to kind of figure out how do you give balance without saying, yeah, but they're a climate change denier and they're all the other scientists, or they're a Nazi and they're all the not Nazis? How does that challenge get tackled?
I think that's a really good question. I think, without getting into kind of specifics of Farage and that sort of stuff, because it's probably not helpful to kind of personalise it. But I think there's a couple of things about having that kind of debate-led coverage. It goes great guns on social media. People, it can make it gets massive imprints and has massive pickup. It is, not to put too fine a point on it, quite cheap to do. If you want to send reporters and cameramen and the like to a place and report on a story, that's all cost and that's all budget. Whereas actually 2 bits of chat costs less. I think also you can look at that being done not just at Sky, but look at how the BBC do the mornings with the Victoria Derbyshire show is a great show, I think. But I think one of the things it does is kind of use chat to allow the BBC to focus on other things. I hope at least that that the way round it worked was never news organisations choosing to look for increasingly more extreme platforms and then sort of art imitating life. I hope at least that the reality was that, UKIP were polling at whatever they were polling at, and we felt, well, this, whatever my view of this guy is, he sort of deserves a voice. I think if you look at America, there's an interesting sort of different example. People, Fox News has almost become a kind of shorthand caricature for lots of things I think people say when they want to say unpleasant things about American cable news. But I think the difference there is that the thing about, and it's not just Fox, MSNBC do it as well. The thing about those news outlets is that they act as a kind of echo chamber for their viewers. And rather than perhaps, some discussion you see on the BBC with on climate change, say, with a climate change, with two people with very diverse views in it, the Fox News approach is often simply reinforcing what their viewers think and feel and that sort of stuff. And in and of itself, it's not my place to suggest that's any better or worse. But I think that at the end of the day, news outlets will all have to respond to what their viewers and consumers want. I think if people just go, I am sick to death of, two dickheads in cheap suits shouting at each other, then I think news outlets will have to sort of respond accordingly.
Fantastic. That is all the time we have, sadly.
I'm sorry to have gone.
Well, fantastic. Thank you very much indeed.